For 7 decades, South Korea was the miracle that defied every economic rule. A nation that rose from the ashes of war to become the world's 14th largest economy, where Samsung smartphones outsold Apple, where K-pop conquered the globe, where bullet trains connected gleaming towers that made Tokyo look outdated. But today, South Korea is trapped in a death spiral it cannot escape. The economy is growing at just 0.9% in 2025, the weakest since the pandemic. The population is collapsing faster than any nation in human history, with a fertility rate of 0.74 children per woman. That's not a typo. 0.74. Every household owes an average of $74,360, debt equal to 90% of the entire economy, the highest in Asia. Young people cannot afford homes that cost 18 years of total income. The president was impeached after declaring martial law. The won crashes every few months, and every year the breakdown accelerates. This is not a temporary recession. This is structural collapse happening in real time. South Korea's skyline still gleams. Samsung still leads in semiconductors. BTS still fills stadiums worldwide. But beneath the surface, the foundations are crumbling. Workers are choosing extinction over parenthood. Entire villages are vanishing. The elderly now outnumber children. And the government has spent $270 billion trying to convince people to have babies, with zero success. If stories like this fascinate you, economic rise and fall, the hidden forces shaping nations, hit that subscribe button. At Big GDP Energy, we dive deep into the geo-economics reshaping our world every week. How does an economic superpower built on discipline and innovation find itself breaking down year after year with no way out? Today, we are exploring why South Korea's economy is caught in a trap of its own making. But here is what almost nobody talks about. The crisis actually started with a decision that was supposed to save the country. A bailout that seemed like salvation in 1997. And we will reveal exactly how that so-called rescue planted the time bomb that is detonating right now, 28 years later. Let's go back to where it all began. The story begins in the ruins of 1953. The Korean War had left the peninsula devastated. GDP per capita was $67, lower than Ghana. There was no electricity in most homes. No paved roads beyond Seoul. The American military governor called it the most depressing place I have ever been. But South Korea had something most poor nations did not. It had a plan. Starting in the 1960s, under President Park Chung-hee, the government made a calculated bet. Forget agriculture. Forget natural resources Korea did not have. Instead, pour everything into manufacturing exports. The model was simple, but brutal. Low wages, long hours, government-directed investment, and an obsessive focus on capturing global market share at any cost. It worked beyond anyone's wildest projections. Between 1960 and 1996, South Korea's GDP grew at an average of 7.3% annually for 36 consecutive years. Read that again. 7.3% growth. Every year for nearly 4 decades. GDP per capita exploded from $158 in 1960 to $13,403 by 1997, an 85-fold increase in 1 generation. In 1960, South Korea's economy was smaller than Sudan's. By 1996, it had become the 11th largest economy in the world. The transformation created global giants that redefined entire industries. Hyundai went from a small construction firm to building ships larger than aircraft carriers, and to making cars that competed with Toyota. Samsung evolved from a trading company that sold dried fish into the world's largest producer of smartphones, memory chips, and display panels. LG pioneered consumer electronics that reached every continent. These were not just companies. They were the chaebol, family-controlled conglomerates that became synonymous with Korean ambition. By the 1990s, South Korea had become the living rebuttal to economic determinism. A resource-poor peninsula with no colonial wealth had outgrown its former colonizers. Korean engineers were building subway systems from Singapore to Stockholm. Korean management systems, like Pali culture, were studied in Harvard case studies. The Korean wave had not yet exploded, but Seoul was already a city of glass towers and a 24-hour work culture that made Manhattan look lazy. The Seoul Olympics in 1988 announced South Korea's arrival. Sleek stadiums, technological marvels. A nation that had been starving 35 years earlier was now hosting the world. By 1996, South Korea joined the OECD, the Club of Rich Nations, becoming the first former aid recipient to achieve developed nation status. The model seemed unstoppable. Export-led growth, government coordination with private giants, Confucian work ethic meeting cutting-edge technology. Currency was kept deliberately weak to boost exports. Wages were rising, but slowly, just enough to prevent social unrest without pricing Korean goods out of global markets. There was a word Koreans used to describe their approach: haen. A complex emotion mixing perseverance, determination, and accumulated resentment. The memory of poverty and humiliation was driving an almost vengeful pursuit of success. South Korea was not just growing. It was proving something to the world that had dismissed it. The entire nation believed its rise was inevitable, unstoppable, divinely ordained. But that confidence, that absolute belief that hard work and government planning could overcome any obstacle, would soon become the seed of its downfall. The trap was set on July 2, 1997. That morning, Thailand floated its currency, the baht, triggering what would become the Asian financial crisis. Within weeks, contagion spread across Asia. Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and then South Korea. Foreign investors looked at South Korea's books and panicked. Korean companies had borrowed massively in dollars to fund expansion, $150 billion in short-term foreign debt. The chaebol were leveraged 500% to 600%, so for every dollar they owed $5 or $6. When global credit markets froze, Korean corporations could not roll over their loans. Banks collapsed. The won plummeted from $800 per dollar to $1,700 per dollar in weeks. By November 1997, South Korea's foreign reserves dropped to just $6 billion. The nation faced sovereign default. On December 3, 1997, South Korea signed the largest International Monetary Fund bailout in history, $58 billion. The deal came with brutal conditions: slash government spending, raise interest rates to 25% overnight, open markets to foreign competition, dismantle the cozy relationship between government and the chaebol, fire millions of workers. Within months, gross domestic product shrank 5.8%. Unemployment exploded from 2.6% to 8.4%. Families sold gold jewelry to save the nation in televised charity drives. Suicide spiked. The miracle on the Han River seemed to drown in its own ambition. But here is where the story takes its fatal turn. South Korea's response to the crisis created the time bomb that is detonating today. To prevent another collapse, the government and the Bank of Korea made a calculated decision. Keep interest rates ultra-low indefinitely. Encourage households to borrow. Inflate asset prices, especially housing, and use cheap debt to stimulate consumption and prevent recession. For other nations recovering from financial crises, like the United States after 2008, this strategy eventually worked. Asset prices recovered. Rates normalized. Debt was paid down. But South Korea never stopped. Interest rates stayed near zero for 15 years. Housing prices in Seoul doubled, then tripled, then quadrupled. The government actively encouraged speculation. Under President Moon Jae-in from 2017 to 2022, despite 25 different policies meant to cool housing, prices in Seoul jumped 90%. Young people watched homes become impossible dreams and made a rational calculation: borrow everything immediately or be priced out forever. Household debt exploded from 84% of GDP in 2015 to 108% by 2021, higher than every other Asian nation. Mortgage debt alone consumed 53% of the total. But even more dangerous were personal loans, young people borrowing not for homes, but for stock speculation, cryptocurrency gambling, and jeonse deposits, a uniquely Korean rental system that requires massive upfront cash. The debt was not funding productive investment. It funded financial speculation and consumer spending to juice short-term GDP numbers. The government knew the danger. The Bank of Korea issued warnings. But every attempt to raise interest rates or cool housing met fierce resistance. Homeowners would riot, the economy would stumble, politicians would backtrack. The addiction to cheap debt had become terminal. By 2024, South Korean household debt reached 186% of disposable income, nearly double the American rate. The average household owed $74,360. In Seoul, buying an apartment required 17.8 years of total income, not mortgage payments, but the price itself. To fix the 1997 IMF crisis, South Korea had created a debt trap that would define the next 30 years. The weapon was not war. It was interest rates and false prosperity built on borrowed time. South Korea is not just heavily indebted. It is carrying debt levels that would trigger immediate financial crisis anywhere else on Earth. Household debt stands at 90% of GDP as of late 2024, the highest ratio in Asia, exceeding even China's 64%. But the real horror shows in debt to income. South Korean households owe 186% of their annual disposable income. In the United States, that ratio is 101%. In Germany, it is 87%. Let that sink in. The average Korean household would need to save every single one earned for nearly 2 full years just to pay off existing debt. That is $74,360 per household. Not per person. Per household. To understand how extreme that is, consider Seoul housing. The average apartment costs 17.8 times annual household income. Buying a 2-bedroom in Gangnam requires 18 years of total earnings, with no food, no transport, no living, just saving. In comparison, New York City housing costs about 7 times annual income, London 10 times, even Tokyo 11 times. How did this happen? After 1997, South Korea's economic model shifted from export-led manufacturing to debt-fueled consumption. The government could not let growth slow. The chaebol demanded expansion. Workers expected rising wages. The Asian tigers were watching. So instead of productivity gains or innovation, growth came from leverage. Ultra-low interest rates made borrowing irresistible. Government housing policies encouraged speculation. Banks competed to lend more aggressively. And culturally, Korean society views home ownership as essential to marriage. No home meant no wedding, no children, no status. Parents pressure young couples to borrow whatever is necessary to buy property. The result is a jeonse rental system that amplifies risk. Tenants pay landlords massive deposits, often 60% to 80% of property value, in exchange for living rent-free. Landlords invest those deposits in more property or stocks. When the system works, everyone profits. But when housing prices fall or investment returns drop, landlords cannot return deposits. Tenants lose life savings. The system implodes. When household debt reaches this level, central banks lose all flexibility. The Bank of Korea wanted to raise rates to fight inflation from 2022 to 2023. But every 0.25% increase meant millions of households defaulting on floating rate loans. So rates stayed low, inflation persisted, and the won collapsed to 15-year lows. Young people face an impossible choice. They can borrow catastrophic amounts and maybe afford a home, or they can give up home ownership entirely and accept permanent renter status in a culture that views that as failure. Many are choosing a third option: leave, or do not have children, or both. And this is not just about housing affordability. When households own 90% of gross domestic product, that debt does not disappear, it constrains consumption for decades. Every one goes to interest payments, not spending. Growth starves. The economy flatlines. South Korea is not managing debt, it is trapped by it, and the trap gets tighter every year. South Korea isn't just experiencing low birth rates, it's facing demographic collapse at a speed and scale unprecedented in human history. The fertility rate hit 0.74 children per woman in 2024. Not 1.74. 0.74. That's a slight increase from 2023's record low of 0.72, but still catastrophically below the 2.1 replacement rate needed to maintain population. No nation in recorded history has ever sustained a fertility rate this low. To understand how extreme that is, if this continues for just 2 generations, a population of 200 would shrink to 25, an 88% decline. That is not gradual aging. That is civilizational extinction happening in real time. The numbers tell a story of national surrender. South Korea became a super-aged society in December 2024, meaning over 20% of citizens are now 65 or older. It took Japan 11 years to reach this status. It took Europe 19 years. South Korea took 7 years. The median age is now 45 and rising fast. By 2072, the population will fall from 51.7 million to 36.2 million, a 30% decline. The elderly will comprise 58% of the total population by 2080. By 2067, there will be 155 elderly people for every 100 working-age adults. Here is how South Korea reached this point. After the 1997 crisis, economic precarity became permanent. Housing became unaffordable. Marriage rates collapsed from 434,900 weddings in 1996 to just 191,000 in 2023. Women entered the workforce in record numbers but faced impossible choices: career or family, never both. South Korea has the worst gender wage gap in the OECD. Maternity leave exists on paper, but using it often means career suicide. Corporate culture demands 60-hour weeks. Childcare costs consume 28% of median household income for families with 2 children. The government has spent $270 billion since 2006 trying to boost births. Cash bonuses, subsidized childcare, parental leave expansions, housing support. Nothing worked. In 2024, the government offered 1 million won, $770 a month, for families with infants under 1 year. Births continued falling. The consequences are already visible in shrinking schools and vanishing towns. Gunwi, a rural community 200 kilometers from Seoul, has become a ghost town. Mobility scooters outnumber children. Elementary schools close every year. Small businesses shutter. The young flee to Seoul, which itself is aging. When fertility drops this low, it creates a feedback loop that is almost impossible to reverse. Fewer children mean fewer future workers. Fewer workers mean lower productivity and GDP. Lower GDP means worse economic prospects. Worse prospects mean even fewer people willing to have children. And here is the darker reality. Surveys show young Koreans want children, but housing costs, work culture, and economic insecurity make it irrational. They are not choosing childlessness. They are choosing survival. South Korea is not just aging, it is vanishing, one empty cradle at a time. And every policy solution comes 30 years too late. On December 3, 2024, at 10:23 p.m., President Yoon Suk-yeol appeared on national television and declared martial law, the first time since 1979. He claimed anti-state forces and North Korean communists had infiltrated the government. He ordered the military to seize the National Assembly. All political activities were banned. Press freedoms were suspended. Democracy was suspended. Within 6 hours, lawmakers scaled walls and broke through military blockades to vote down the decree 190-0. Yoon rescinded martial law at 4:30 a.m., but the damage was done. On December 14, 2024, Yoon was impeached. On April 4, 2025, the Constitutional Court upheld his removal in an 8-0 unanimous decision. On June 3, 2025, Lee Jae-myung won the snap presidential election with 49.4% of the vote, the highest turnout since 1997. He took office on June 4 with no transition period, inheriting a nation in crisis. The 6 months of political chaos devastated an already fragile economy. Consumer confidence dropped 12.3 points in December 2024, the largest decline since March 2020. The won crashed to 1,481 per dollar, the weakest in 15 years. Foreign investors sold off $700 million in Korean stocks in 3 days. Restaurants closed during lunch hours. Tourism collapsed. The Jeju air crash on December 29, 2024 compounded the crisis, killing 179 and triggering 68,000 flight cancellations. GDP contracted 0.2% in Q1 2025. Business confidence plummeted. The interim government was paralyzed, and acting presidents were impeached twice in succession. President Lee Jae-myung faces an impossible mandate. He promised economic revival, but inherited an economy forecast to grow just 0.9% in 2025, the worst since the pandemic. He pledged fiscal stimulus, $14.6 billion in June, $23.3 billion in July, and an 8.1% budget increase for 2026. But stimulus funded by debt only deepens the trap. And the political divisions did not heal. Yoon's supporters, energized by right-wing media and religious conservatives, view Lee's election as illegitimate. Mass protests continue. The nation remains split between those demanding liquidation of insurrectionist forces and those claiming Lee as a communist sympathizer. Political instability is not just a crisis. It is now a permanent feature. When investors see a president declaring martial law, getting impeached, and the nation descending into constitutional crisis while facing demographic collapse and debt crisis simultaneously, they F Lee. Capital flight accelerates. The won weakens. Imports cost more. Inflation rises. The Bank of Korea cannot raise rates because of household debt. Every policy choice makes something worse. South Korea's political system has become another weight dragging the economy down. And there is no stability in sight. South Korea's economy rests on a single pillar: exports. And that pillar is cracking under pressure from every direction. 87% of GDP is tied to exports, among the highest export dependencies in the developed world. Semiconductors alone represent 20% of total exports, with Samsung and SK Hynix dominating memory chip production. Automobiles, ships, petrochemicals, and displays make up most of the rest. But here is the trap. 19.5% of exports go to China. 18.7% go to the United States. That concentration used to be a strength. Now it is an existential vulnerability. The trade war between the US and China puts South Korea in an impossible position. Semiconductors go to both. Choosing sides means economic suicide. When Trump imposed 25% tariffs on South Korean exports in early 2025, the economy contracted. In July 2025, Lee Jae-myung negotiated the rate down to 15% by pledging $350 billion in US investment. But those funds must come from somewhere, meaning less domestic investment. Meanwhile, China, once South Korea's largest trade partner, is no longer the guaranteed market it was. South Korea's trade balance with China flipped from a $44.3 billion surplus in 2017 to a $6.4 billion deficit in 2024. Chinese companies like SMIC and YMTC are catching up in semiconductors. BYD is crushing Hyundai in electric vehicles. China does not need Korean technology anymore. South Korea's export model depends on being the premium Asian manufacturer, higher quality than China, lower cost than Japan. But that window is closing. China moves upmarket. Japan maintains technological leads in materials and equipment. South Korea gets squeezed. And there is no pivot strategy. Diversifying exports requires years of research and development investment and market development. Building new industries demands startup capital, a risk-taking culture, and immigration to expand talent pools. South Korea has none of these. When 87% of your GDP depends on exports and your two largest markets are decoupling from each other while each demands loyalty, there is no safe choice. Every year, the export dependency becomes more dangerous. Every year, the geopolitical vice tightens. And South Korea, lacking natural resources, a large domestic market, or economic alternatives, watches its competitive advantage erode month by month. The platform that lifted 51 million people from poverty is crumbling. And there is no replacement being built. South Korea's greatest strength, its discipline, its work ethic, its collective determination, has become a trap it cannot escape. The pali-pali culture that built Samsung and Hyundai now burns out workers at record rates. South Korea has the longest working hours among OECD countries, 1,915 hours annually, compared to 1,791 hours in the US and 1,349 hours in Germany. The culture of presenteeism, staying at the office long after productivity ends, persists despite labor law reforms. The consequences are stark. South Korea has the highest suicide rate among OECD countries. Youth unemployment sits at 7.2% officially, but underemployment is far higher. University graduates face a brutal reality. Chaebol jobs offer stability, but demand soul-crushing hours. Startups offer autonomy, but minimal pay and high failure rates. Most choose GOSI, studying for years to pass civil service exams for stable government jobs, effectively removing themselves from productive work. Risk aversion has metastasized. Starting a business in South Korea ranks 33rd in the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index. Failure carries social stigma that lasts generations, and bankruptcy laws were historically punitive. The chaebol still controls 60% of gross domestic product, crushing smaller competitors through vertical integration and political influence. Gender relations have become openly hostile. Men face mandatory military service for 18 to 21 months, putting them behind female peers in career advancement. Women face discrimination so severe that the fertility collapse is partially explained as a gender strike, refusing to have children in a system that punishes mothers. Online, communities like Ilba and Megalia hurl abuse at each other with escalating venom. Immigration remains taboo despite a demographic crisis. South Korea accepts just 3.3% of asylum applications, among the lowest in the OECD. The notion of multiculturalism faces resistance rooted in ethnic nationalism. Without immigration, there is no demographic escape. The discipline that rebuilt a nation has calcified into rigidity. The collective spirit that overcame poverty now enforces conformity that stifles innovation. The work ethic that created miracles now produces only exhaustion. South Korea is not just trapped by economics, it is trapped by culture. And culture, unlike policy, cannot be reformed by government decree. So can South Korea reinvent itself? Can it escape the debt trap, reverse demographic collapse, and find a new economic model before the foundations completely crumble? Or will it become the first developed nation to decline back into middle-income status? The reality is sobering. The population is shrinking and aging with mathematical certainty. Nothing can change the demographics in 2050 now. Household debt at 90% of gross domestic product cannot be quickly reduced without triggering recession. The export model faces geopolitical headwinds that will not ease. Political divisions show no signs of healing. And cultural transformation takes generations, not election cycles. These are not distant threats. They are today's reality, compounding year after year. Yet South Koreans are adapting with characteristic determination. Robots are being deployed in warehouses and nursing homes to offset worker shortages. Artificial intelligence investment is accelerating, with President Lee pledging $73 billion to make South Korea a top 3 artificial intelligence power. Empty schools are being repurposed as community centers. Companies are experimenting with 4.5-day work weeks. Some young people are finding peace in rejection of traditional success metrics, choosing remote work, minimalism, and deliberate childlessness over the brutal competition their parents endured. But here is the uncomfortable truth. It is not the rebirth of growth. It is the slow art of endurance. Adaptation to decline. Acceptance that South Korea of 2050 will be smaller, older, and less influential than South Korea of 2020. South Korea's struggle isn't only South Korea's story anymore. Japan walked this path first. China faces the same demographic cliff. Europe ages rapidly. Even the United States grapples with declining birth rates and political dysfunction. The question isn't whether decline can happen to wealthy nations. South Korea proves it can. The question is whether any nation can escape the trap once sprung. Perhaps the lesson isn't that South Korea failed. Perhaps it's that the export-led, debt-fueled, work-until-you-die model that lifted Asia out of poverty contains inherent expiration dates. Perhaps every miracle, no matter how spectacular, eventually exhausts the people who make it possible. And maybe that exhaustion, that collective decision to stop sacrificing everything for growth, is the most human thing of all.